After my divorce, all I wanted was a quiet place to start over, far from the city and everything that reminded me of the life I'd left behind. I chose a small house in a quiet, rural town where time seemed to pass slowly, almost like the world around it existed in another rhythm. The house had a lovely garden and trees around it, isolated enough to give me the peace I desperately sought. On the first night, I noticed that the silence there was different, dense, almost uncomfortable. During the day, the sound of the wind in the trees or the birds singing made the environment seem normal, even pleasant. But at night, the silence was complete. It was the kind of quiet that made every sound feel amplified. I tried to convince myself it was just the strangeness of the beginning. A new place, new sensations, but even so, the discomfort was there, like an invisible shadow that wouldn't let me fully relax. At work, my colleagues asked a few questions about choosing to live in such an isolated place. I just smiled, saying it was to escape everything and everyone, half jokingly, but it was true. No one questioned much, but I heard a few murmurs about strange events in that area, which only heightened my initial unease. I chose to ignore it and continue with my routine, trying to stay focused on the fresh start I so desperately needed. It was in the first week that I met my neighbor from the house next door, Mrs. Sophia. I saw her for the first time at the gate. A lady with carefully kept white hair, with a warm smile and a look that seemed to understand exactly how I felt. "You're new here, right?" she asked, approaching with an unexpected gentleness. I confirmed, and soon we were talking about the neighborhood and life in town. Mrs. Sophia invited me for coffee at her house that afternoon, and although my initial plan was to keep my distance, I accepted her invitation. The conversation was light, and the warm atmosphere of her home made me feel at peace, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Visits to Mrs. Sophia became a sort of ritual. Every day after work, I'd stop by her house for a cup of coffee. She was a great listener, and somehow, her company helped ease the loneliness and sense of discomfort I couldn't quite explain. There was an atmosphere in the town that wasn't entirely welcoming. I noticed other neighbors looking at me oddly when I mentioned I lived in that house. I even overheard a conversation between two women whispering about something that seemed to be a sad past in the neighborhood, but I chose not to pay attention. The more I grew fond of my talks with Mrs. Sophia, the less I wanted to think about the tensions around me. A few days later, I started noticing little details that, while seemingly insignificant, left me feeling uneasy. In the middle of the night, I would hear noises coming from the kitchen, soft footsteps and the sound of drawers opening and closing. I jumped out of bed at one point, but when I reached the kitchen, nothing was out of place. Everything seemed normal, enveloped in complete silence. I convinced myself it was just the house, maybe the plumbing or the unsettling. However, one night I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee filling the house. Confused, I realized I hadn't made any coffee. I went down to the kitchen, and there was the coffee maker, untouched and cold, just as it should have been. Yet the aroma lingered in the air, warm and strong, as if someone had brewed coffee minutes before. Trying not to scare myself, I took a deep breath and went back to bed, repeating to myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. It was probably exhaustion, the emotional strain of the divorce, and the sudden move. These small incidents kept happening. Sometimes, when I got home from work, I'd notice objects out of place, little things only someone living alone would notice. A cup turned the wrong way in the dish rack, a chair slightly pulled out. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something unusual was going on. The noises grew more frequent, making it impossible to ignore them. One night, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway, and when I looked, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving quickly before disappearing. My heart was racing so fast that, for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. I mustered the courage to investigate, but when I turned on the lights, there was nothing. I started to wonder if I was becoming paranoid, yet the sense of someone else's presence in the house, even without seeing anyone, grew stronger by the day. Each day, the need to go to Mrs. Sophia's house became more intense. Talking to her was the only time I felt truly safe and at peace. I'd tell her about work, and sometimes, laughing it off, I'd mention that the house made strange sounds at night. She'd laugh along, saying it was natural for old houses to breathe in silence. Somehow, that calmed me, though deep down, I knew it was more than that. Then one evening, after a particularly tense day at work, I decided to stop by Mrs. Sophia's house to unwind. I knocked on the door once, twice, but no one answered. I found it strange, as she was always there at that time. I waited a few minutes, knocking again, but the silence remained. Returning to my house, the feeling of emptiness and loneliness was stronger than ever, and the idea of truly being alone filled me with an anxiety I couldn't shake. That day, I decided to speak with other neighbors, hoping someone might have seen Mrs. Sophia recently. After a disturbing night where the sounds and the feeling of being watched seemed to intensify, I decided it was time to get answers about Mrs. Sophia. The next morning, I spotted one of the neighbors on the block, an elderly man I often saw tending his garden. "Have you seen Mrs. Sophia recently? The lady who lives next door?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I felt a growing unease. He looked at me with a strange expression, as if he didn't understand the question. "My dear, no one has lived in that house for years. The last resident was a lady, Mrs. Sophia, but she passed away a long time ago, about 7 years back, if I remember correctly." A chill ran down my spine, and my hands started to shake. The world around me seemed to slow down, and the thought that I might have been imagining everything became nearly unbearable. I tried explaining that I had been spending time with Mrs. Sophia, drinking coffee in her house, but the neighbor shook his head, looking serious, almost pitying. I returned home in a state of shock. Memories of our conversations, her smile, the cups of coffee, none of it could be a figment of my imagination, but the explanation seemed impossible. I spent the rest of the day spiraling, revisiting every detail, trying to find some logical error. That night, the silence in the house became suffocating, and the sensation of being watched felt stronger than ever, as if the house itself was aware of my distress. Struggling to control my growing panic, I packed my things, determined to leave that house. But as I was organizing my belongings, I heard a sound, a whispered voice calling my name from the hallway. I froze. It was a voice I knew well, Mrs. Sophia's gentle voice. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The darkness seemed thicker and more oppressive, and for a split second, I thought I saw an indistinct figure before me, like a shadow fading and reforming. The voice whispered again, this time closer. "You're never alone, dear." Terrified, I ran to the door, fighting to keep my sanity. With every step, the presence seemed closer, until I finally made it out into the garden, feeling the cold night air on my face. I stood there, breathless and in shock, trying to convince myself that I was safe. Even after leaving that house, the trauma stayed with me. No matter how much I tried to move on with my life, the smell of fresh coffee, the inexplicable sounds, and the feeling of someone still watching me never truly left. When Emily and I found the house, we knew we had found the perfect place. Small but charming, in a quiet neighborhood. It was everything we wanted to start our new life together. In the mornings, birds sang, filling the air with peace, and at night, the soft lights from surrounding houses seemed to create an invisible shield over the neighborhood. We were sure our choice had been spot on. In the first week, though, we noticed our neighbor on the left, Mr. Gregory, seemed different. He was an older man, always with a stern expression, barely moving as he worked in his yard. Often, we would see him trimming the grass or pruning bushes, but he never really seemed focused on gardening. In fact, his eyes always seemed to follow our every move, discreetly, yet attentively. Every time we went out, there he was, standing with a rake in hand, watching. And when I looked back, he would quickly turn away, as if he didn't want to be caught. It was the sort of thing one tends to ignore. I tried convincing myself he was just a lonely old man, maybe looking for something to occupy his time. But that constant stare, the way he vanished from sight the moment I turned, started to bother me. When I mentioned it to Emily, I realized she had noticed it too. Maybe he's just curious about the new neighbors, she would say, trying to ease the discomfort, but the feeling of being watched lingered, almost as if it was tangible. One morning, about 2 weeks after we moved in, we found the first note. It was carefully folded and tucked under the front door. The handwriting was angular and firm, almost drawn. "This neighborhood can be dangerous. Be careful going out at night. A concerned neighbor." I held the note for a while, trying to understand the purpose behind it. I showed it to Emily, who shrugged, suggesting it was probably just someone trying to be thoughtful. "It's probably someone trying to be polite," she said, with a hesitant smile. That sounded reasonable enough, but the message lingered with me in an unsettling way. It was a warning, but there was something wrong in its tone, as if it held a second meaning, something we couldn't see. Days later, another note appeared, just as mysterious as the first. "Things aren't always what they seem. Stay alert." This time, a chill went down my spine. I wondered who could be sending us these notes and why. Emily suggested it could be Mr. Gregory, but she seemed uncomfortable with the thought herself. We decided not to dwell on it and simply move on with our lives, ignoring the notes. But it seemed that the more we tried to forget them, the more present they became, like a lingering shadow over our new home. Late one gray afternoon, we found the third note. This one was different. It wasn't folded and tucked under the door like the others, but carefully placed on our doormat, as if whoever left it intended for it to be seen. "Someone might be watching. Be careful." The message was as brief as the others, but the sense of alert felt even stronger. It was as if the paper itself radiated a silent warning, bringing a new wave of unease over me. That night, I couldn't relax. I had the feeling that, with every small movement around the house, unseen eyes were following us. Emily tried to reassure me, but it was clear she was beginning to feel the same discomfort. We still didn't know who was sending these notes, but the idea of Mr. Gregory crept into our minds. He seemed to know everything about the neighborhood, and his constant presence was starting to feel almost invasive. The next morning, just as we were heading out to work, we saw him standing on the sidewalk, a few feet from our door. He was staring directly at us, his gaze intense, holding a new note in his hand. "Be careful," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He handed me the paper and turned away, heading back to his house without another word. When we looked at the note, I saw it was as cryptic as the previous ones, but the impact of having seen him, watching us from such a close distance, was impossible to ignore. That night, we didn't say much. Every attempt to relax was interrupted by the silent presence of Gregory haunting our thoughts. It was a deeply disturbing feeling, and every shadow outside the windows seemed to hide a dark mystery. There was a heavy silence until, in the middle of the night, I heard a sound in the hallway. I got up slowly and went to the door, noticing that one of the front windows was covered with a dark tape that hadn't been there before. The feeling of being watched was so intense it seemed to envelop the entire house. The next day, Emily and I decided we had endured enough. It was time to confront Mr. Gregory. That morning, we walked over to his door, determined to put an end to this unease. He opened without hesitation, and his cold gaze made my stomach twist. Before I could speak, he began, in a soft, disturbingly calm tone. "I just want to protect you." "Protect us? Protect us from what?" The words left my mouth before I could control my tone. He looked at us for a moment, then gestured toward the inside of his house. "There are many things out there, things you don't see. I watch because it's my duty to protect the neighborhood." Inside his house, I could see various notes, sheets upon sheets of meticulously written observations, pieces of paper detailing our schedules, dates, and even small reminders of things only we should know. A wave of panic swept over me. Gregory hadn't just been watching us. He was practically living our lives. The notes were a reflection of his obsession with protecting us, an obsession that had turned into a deep invasion of privacy. After a moment of shock, Emily and I quickly left. We made it back home, and without a second thought, we began planning our departure from that place. Within days, we left everything behind, but the impact stayed with us. Sometimes, at night, I still feel that someone is watching us. Every time a new neighbor greets us or asks about our routine, I can't help but feel uneasy, remembering Gregory's cold gaze and his detailed notes. Even now, far away, it's as if his presence still haunts us. Moving to the farmhouse seemed like a great idea. Leaving the city, the constant noise and the rush, it was everything we wanted. When we arrived, the house had a charming air about it. The weathered wood seemed loaded with history, which only made it more intriguing. The kids were running excitedly around the yard, while my wife explored the interior of the house, admiring the vast view of the hills. But deep down, something didn't feel quite right. I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Maybe it was the strange, thick silence that enveloped the place. As the day went on and the house began to fill with our things, this sense of unease grew, almost imperceptibly, but constantly. By the time we finished unpacking, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the sky, and I glanced at the basement, an area I'd avoided exploring too thoroughly. The entrance was in the kitchen, an old wooden door that creaked at the slightest touch. We went down, and the damp, acrid smell of mold filled the space, as if the air had been trapped there for decades. The room felt dense, heavy, and I noticed my wife's wary look around. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She nodded, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. We did a quick inspection and left, promising ourselves we'd handle the ventilation issue later. That night, as I tried to sleep, I could only hear the sound of the wind outside. It was almost as if the silence was too much, muffling any natural sounds. I tried to relax, but there was a slight tension in the air, a subtle presence I couldn't ignore. The next day, as we settled in, I sensed that my wife was restless. She had never been superstitious, but she seemed to be avoiding it, and I knew something was bothering her. We talked about the house's history, and she mentioned a detail we hadn't taken seriously when we bought it. The house had once belonged to a family that, apparently, had disappeared without a trace. I thought it was just a rumor or local lore, but I could see she took it seriously. It was that very night that the noise began. It was a low, dragging sound, soft but just enough to make us hold our breath. It seemed to come from the basement. At first, I ignored it, telling myself it must have been some old structure of the house, maybe a pipe we hadn't noticed before. But the noise persisted, and my wife heard it too. I tried to calm her, saying it was natural for an old house, but deep down, I felt a twinge of doubt. The nights became increasingly tense. Every time we tried to ignore that sound, it seemed to respond, as if it knew we were listening. At one point, I even started getting used to hearing it, but my wife couldn't hide her discomfort. And then, on the third night, something changed. The sound of chains, once soft, became louder, more distinct. It no longer seemed like some random noise. There was a pattern, almost as if someone was deliberately dragging something. The next morning, as I went down to the basement with a flashlight to investigate, my eyes landed on fine marks on the floor. They looked like scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. I knelt to take a closer look, running my fingers along the lines scratched into the concrete. They twisted across the floor, weaving an erratic, almost deliberate path. I tried to ignore the shiver running down my spine as I thought about what could make such a trail. I went back upstairs, convincing myself that those marks had been there all along. My wife was genuinely worried. Even the kids, though they didn't understand, seemed more withdrawn, especially our eldest daughter, who had asked why she kept hearing the chain sound at night. That unsettled me even more. I didn't want them to be scared, so I tried to keep calm, but each night, The noise grew louder, disturbing our sleep and fraying our nerves. It felt as if whatever was making the sound was getting bolder, closer, almost like it was moving through the house itself. The last night was unbearable. The sound started early, much louder than before, echoing through the house as if the very structure was groaning. By this point, my wife wanted to leave, but I needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight, and with my heart pounding, we both went down to the basement. The air there felt almost tangible, so dense that each step felt heavier than the last. I could feel the walls pressing in, the smell of decay stronger, almost suffocating us with each breath. That's when we saw it. In the darkest corner of the basement, a spectral figure took shape, a shadow of a person chained, writhing, trapped in agonizing despair. Its screams were muffled, almost as if they came from another time, but clear enough to freeze us in place. The figure stretched its hands toward us, and for a moment, I felt an invisible weight pulling me. Every part of me screamed to leave, but my legs felt glued to the ground, as if the basement itself were trapping me, drawing me closer to this tormented soul. When we finally managed to move, we ran back up the stairs, but the door slammed shut with a loud crash before we could reach it. We stood there, trapped, the sound of chains growing louder, and the shadows around us expanding, twisting into grotesque shapes. At that moment, I thought we'd never see the sunrise again. Only when the first rays of dawn filtered through the door did the air lighten, and we were able to escape the basement. We left that house the same day, but the sound of chains and the echo of despair still haunt me to this day. I needed a quiet place where I could start fresh, leaving the weight of the past few months behind me. When I found the apartment, something about it matched what I was looking for. A modest retreat in an old building in a nearly forgotten part of the city. It was the kind of place where nobody asks too many questions, and everyone just goes about their lives. I paid the first rent and moved in, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt a slight discomfort, something I ignored at the time. The apartment had its quirks. The yellowed walls, worn-out furniture, and the creak of each floorboard had what I'd call a rustic charm. However, there was a small door in the back of the living room that bothered me. It seemed out of place, and I avoided looking at it without really knowing why. It wasn't just an ordinary door. Its mere presence felt ominous, like it was hiding something I wasn't meant to uncover. The first few days were calm. I went to work, came home, and tried to settle into the new space. Still, a strange feeling that the apartment was watching me began to grow. It didn't take long for that initial discomfort to become a more constant presence, something I tried to ignore, but that inevitably lingered in every corner. I met the landlord a few days after I moved in. He showed up unannounced, banging on the door, and the sound echoed through the empty hallway. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with an older man, with tired eyes and a stern expression. He stepped in without ceremony, glancing around the apartment as if he were checking for something. His gaze stopped on the small door at the back of the room, and he frowned. "Remember the rules," he said, his tone less of a guideline and more of a warning. "Here, things work a certain way, and I expect you to respect that." I tried to ask about these rules, but he just looked at me, his expression hardened, and shook his head as if I didn't need to know more. My interactions with the neighbors were equally unsettling. They all seemed slightly evasive. Some even looked away when I passed by. There was a certain stillness in the building, something that made every step and every sound feel amplified. Gradually, I started feeling isolated, trapped in a space that felt anything but welcoming. Something in the way the other tenants looked at me left me uneasy, as if they knew something I had yet to discover. One day, when I got home earlier than usual, I noticed something strange as soon as I reached the door. It was slightly open. For a second, I stood there, my hand trembling over the doorknob, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd left the door unlatched that morning, but I knew that wasn't the case. I always locked the door before leaving. I took a deep breath and slowly pushed it open, stepping inside cautiously. Everything seemed to be in place, but a chill ran down my spine. I scanned every corner of the apartment, checking drawers and shelves. Nothing seemed out of place, but something was wrong. I just didn't know what. That feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I went downstairs to confront the landlord. "My door was open when I got home," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. He just smiled, as if he had been expecting this conversation. "Oh, you noticed, did you? Well, don't worry, that's just a small detail that most people end up accepting," he said, his voice holding an unsettling tone. "Who has a key to my door besides me?" I asked, struggling to hide my frustration. He tilted his head and responded without hesitation. "Here, you only live. Possession. That's another story." Those words echoed in my mind as I returned to the apartment. Possession. That's another story. Those words, and the cold look that accompanied them, left an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't shake. The next day, I went to a hardware store and bought a new lock. I replaced it carefully, making sure no one else could access my apartment. That feeling of security didn't last long. In the following nights, I started noticing strange things. Some objects seemed out of place. My keys, which I always left by the entrance, were once found on the floor, far from where I'd put them. My bed on the last night looked slightly disheveled when I arrived, as if someone had lain on it. One night, as I was getting ready to sleep, I noticed an unusual glint in the corner of the room. Approaching it, I found a hidden camera on the shelf. My heart raced. The idea that someone was watching me, observing my every move, made a wave of panic wash over me. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent hours rummaging through every corner of the apartment, searching for other hidden devices. Finally, in a desperate impulse, I opened the small door at the back of the living room. There was a narrow, worn staircase leading to the basement. Down there, I found dusty furniture and several marks on the floor, as if someone frequently walked around that area. The walls seemed drenched in ancient moisture, and the air was thick with a sour smell that almost made me gag. There was no doubt, the place held secrets far deeper than I'd imagined. That night, I was jolted awake by a subtle noise. Someone was trying to unlock the door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, as I watched the doorknob turn unsuccessfully. Finally, the sound stopped, but to my surprise, I heard footsteps outside, slowly moving away down the hallway. A chill ran down my spine. I knew who was out there. The next morning, I waited for the landlord in the hallway, determined to confront him. He appeared, as usual, with that impassive look. "Is there a problem?" he asked, with an expression of feigned concern. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were trembling. "Why did you try to enter my apartment last night? And why are there hidden cameras in my room?" He looked me up and down and, with a cold smile, replied, "Here, no one owns anything. Don't you understand? This building, it never belonged to you." Those words echoed like a dark warning. Realizing what he was implying sent a pang of panic through me. He turned and started down the stairs, but before leaving, he cast one last look over his shoulder and said, "And no one has ever really left." A sudden courage drove me to investigate the basement again. I descended the narrow stairs and, upon entering the dark room, found what looked like a collection of abandoned personal belongings. Diaries, photos, old clothes. They all belonged to previous tenants. Tenants who, apparently, had never left that place. Shock turned to dread when I heard footsteps descending the stairs behind me. The landlord was following me. The only thought running through my mind was to escape. I dodged the old furniture and rushed back up to my apartment, feeling the weight of his gaze with each step. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathless. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything that could help me. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, explaining what had happened, begging him to help me get out of there as soon as possible. I left that building in a hurry, not looking back. However, the fear never left me. Even after finding a new place to live, I still feel like I'm being watched. At night, I check locks and windows repeatedly, convinced that something or someone is still observing me. I can't erase the landlord's words from my mind. No one has ever really left. To this day, every time I hear a creak or feel an eerie presence, I wonder if some part of that house is still haunting me, bringing back the living memory of what I found in that basement, and the feeling that maybe the terror never truly ended.